Hey there, viewers. Before we get into today's story, let me know, are you watching this in the morning, afternoon, or late at night? It's always interesting to see where and when people are tuning in. Now, what's happening to Diddy behind bars is something few expected, and trust me, you'll want to hear this. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Man Who Once Had It All. Sean Combs had once walked into every room like he owned it. Because, in some ways, he did. He was a king in the music world, a billionaire with more connections than most politicians, and a man who could make or break careers with a single phone call. But none of that mattered now. The only door that opened for him these days was the thick, metal one sealing him inside a 6-by-8-foot cell, where the air smelled like sweat, bleach, and old regrets. His first few hours inside MDC Brooklyn had been a blur of shouting, metal clanking, and the unmistakable weight of eyes watching him. They all knew who he was. Some recognized him immediately, others had to be told, but the reactions were all the same. The process had been stripped of all dignity. They had made him squat and cough, check for contraband, spread his arms while they searched for weapons he never had. Then came the orange jumpsuit, the standard-issued shoes that felt like they belonged to someone else, and a thin mattress he'd be sleeping on from now on. Here, at MDC Brooklyn, he was just another inmate. No special treatment, no million-dollar lawyers standing behind him with briefcases full of loopholes. Just a name on a roster and a number on a jumpsuit. The first thing they took was his clothes. He stood in a cold, gray-walled room while a guard barked instructions at him. Strip, open your mouth. Lift your arms, spread your legs, squat, and cough. It was a process designed to humiliate, and it worked. He had never felt smaller. He tried not to think about who had worn the jumpsuit before him, whose sweat had soaked into the fabric. He tried not to think about the dozens of men who had probably used the same mattress before it was assigned to him. He just took it, same as the others, and followed orders. The walk to his cell felt longer than it should have. Maybe it was the weight of it all. Maybe it was the way the inmates pressed against the bars as he passed, their eyes locked onto him. Some called out, some laughed, others just stared. "Ain't no bodyguards in here, Puff. That money don't mean shit now. Man, what's he even doing here?" He kept his head forward, jaw clenched, ignoring every word. He had always known how to command a room, how to make people listen without saying much at all. But here, he had no control. His presence didn't intimidate anyone. If anything, it amused them. Diddy sat on the hard mattress, hands resting on his knees, staring at the wall. The cell was smaller than his walk-in closet. The single flickering fluorescent light above him cast a dull glow, making everything feel colder than it already was. The walls were stained with time, covered in scratches and carvings from inmates who had come before him. Some had left their names. Others had written messages, pieces of themselves etched into concrete. He ran his fingers over the rough surface, tracing words left behind by men who had once stood exactly where he was standing now. Some of them had probably died in here. That thought sat heavy on his chest. He could hear the sounds of prison life echoing down the halls, metal doors slamming, a distant argument turning into a scuffle, laughter that carried a cruel edge. Someone in the next cell was snoring loud enough to shake the walls. Someone else was whispering fast and low, talking about something he couldn't make out. He had thought about calling someone, his lawyer, his team, someone who could remind him that this was temporary. But even if he picked up the phone, what would he say? Get me out of here? That wasn't happening. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The guards weren't cruel. Not exactly. They weren't interested in beating him down or making a statement. But they also weren't offering him any favors. They treated him like any other prisoner. No acknowledgement of who he was, no recognition in their eyes. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, gave him a hard look before saying, "You're in here like everyone else. Get used to it." At dinner, he had tried to keep his head down, but that didn't stop the whispers. His first meal was a tray of something that vaguely resembled food, a scoop of grayish mashed potatoes, a slab of dry, overcooked meat, and a carton of milk that looked like it had been sitting in storage for weeks. He forced himself to eat, though every bite felt like punishment. Across the room, inmates watched him, whispering among themselves. Some smirked, others just observed. Diddy nodded, even though he knew there was nothing to get used to. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his world, but it was real, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. That first night, he lay on the mattress staring up at the ceiling. The light overhead flickered every few minutes, buzzing softly in the silence. He could hear everything: the shuffle of feet, the sound of a toilet flushing a few cells down, the occasional burst of laughter followed by someone telling another man to shut up. It never truly got quiet. Somewhere close by, someone was watching him. He could feel it. He shifted, turning onto his side, but the feeling didn't go away. The eyes were still there, studying him, waiting. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity, hatred, or something else. He just knew he didn't like it. He'd always been able to control situations, to dictate how things played out. He built an empire on that ability. But now, he wasn't in charge. He wasn't the one making the rules. And the men in here? They weren't going to let him forget that. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. The ones who looked at him like he was a prize. The ones who whispered his name like it meant something to them. The ones who didn't whisper at all, just stared with cold, empty eyes. He had seen power shift before. He had been part of it, pulling strings behind the scenes, making decisions that changed lives. But in here, the rules were different. In here, the powerful weren't the ones with money. The powerful were the ones who had nothing left to lose. The realization settled into his chest like a heavy weight. He wasn't scared, not yet, but he understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped before. The world he once ruled was gone. And this new world? It didn't belong to him. Chapter 2. The Reality of MDC Brooklyn. The first week at MDC Brooklyn passed in a haze of confusion and exhaustion. Diddy had spent his life surrounded by luxury yes-men and the kind of comfort that made you forget about the harsh realities of the world. But none of that mattered now. The screeching metal doors and the sound of keychains clinking had replaced the hum of private jets and the clink of expensive glasses. He could hardly remember what it felt like to be treated like someone special. Because in here, he was nobody. MDC wasn't a place for the faint of heart. It was overcrowded, dark, and smelled like stale air mixed with the scent of sweat and grime. The walls were gray, like something out of a nightmare. Every hallway felt like it led deeper into the belly of a beast, unpredictable, unforgiving. Inside, it wasn't just hardened criminals who made it hell. There were also the snitches, the desperate men, and the ones who didn't care about anything anymore. Diddy had expected something rough, sure, but he hadn't prepared for this. He hadn't prepared for life inside these walls. There were no red carpets, no security guards protecting him. In fact, no one really cared that he was famous. There was no escaping the cold reality of prison life. He wasn't prepared for the rules, the unspoken ones that shaped the prison economy, the trade of favors, cigarettes, and information. He didn't understand who to trust, who had power, and who would stab him in the back just to survive. So, he took refuge in his faith. The bathroom situation alone was enough to make him wish for his old life back. The toilets were always clogged, the sinks were barely usable, and the showers were ice cold, the kind of cold that cut through you like a knife. There was no privacy, no space to breathe. Every time he went to the bathroom, there were eyes on him. Inmates would walk by, giving him quick, assessing glances. Some of them snickered, while others whispered quietly to their neighbors. He couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being watched, that at any moment, someone could decide he was weak enough to target. And the food? It was something straight out of a horror movie. Mystery meat that barely resembled what you would call food, beans so watered down you wondered if they had even seen a real bean, and a stale roll that didn't fill you up but made your stomach feel worse. The cafeteria smelled like wet cardboard, and every bite felt like a punishment. At first, Diddy tried to eat, but it wasn't long before the taste of everything started making him lose his appetite. The food was disgusting, and it didn't take long before he started noticing the changes in his body. His clothes, already loose from stress, became even looser. His reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the sink showed a gaunt, thinner version of himself. The weight was falling off faster than he could control it, and the feeling of weakness was starting to sink in. But there was no one to complain to here, no assistants to grab him a drink or bring him his favorite meal. No one cared about Diddy's favorite luxury foods. He was just another inmate, one in a long line of men who had probably lost more than just their weight behind bars. Diddy had never been one to back down from a challenge. He had battled in the boardroom and fought for every inch of power he'd ever gained. But here, he was out of his depth. He was no longer a mogul or a kingmaker. He was a man with no money, no influence, and no real allies. He didn't know the prison's social hierarchy. He didn't know who ran things here, who could offer protection, or who to avoid at all costs. His first few days were spent observing, trying to figure out the power dynamics. Some inmates mocked him, shouting out taunts that cut deep even though he didn't respond. "Where's your $1 million champagne now, huh, Diddy?" One man jeered. Another called out, "I heard you liked the good life. Guess you're stuck with the rest of us now." There were others who just stared at him. Their eyes didn't hold the same hatred as the ones who mocked him. They were calculating. They sized him up, waiting for the moment when he would show weakness. The truth was, Diddy didn't know what they saw when they looked at him. Maybe they saw an easy target. Maybe they saw a man who would crack under pressure. But one inmate's words stuck with him more than all the others. "You ain't special here," the man said, his voice low but firm. "The second you act like you are, you're done." It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. A realization that in this world, money and fame didn't matter. There was no VIP treatment here, no special privileges. It didn't matter who you were or what you had done before. You were just another face in the crowd now, just another man trying to survive another day. He had always been used to watching people, to being the one in control. In his business world, people watched him, waited for his next move. But here, he wasn't the one pulling the strings. He was the one being watched. At night, the feeling of eyes on him never went away. Whether it was the guards on duty or the inmates passing by, he couldn't shake the sense that someone was always looking at him, observing his every move. He had thought it was just paranoia at first, but as time went on, it became clear that he was right. It wasn't just the inmates. Someone else was keeping tabs on him. One night, while he was trying to sleep, Diddy swore he saw a guard lurking by the door of his cell, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He couldn't be sure if he was imagining things, if his mind was starting to play tricks on him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't just a random guard. The feeling grew stronger with each passing day. He was being watched. But the question remained, who was watching him and why? It was becoming clear that the game wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about power, about control. Diddy wasn't sure who was pulling the strings, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone in here. There were people with their own agendas, people who didn't care about his past, his money, or his reputation, people who only cared about one thing, what he could offer them. This situation resulted. The realization hit him harder than any blow he had ever taken. In this world, he was no longer in control, and he had no idea who to trust. Chapter 3. The Search. The night started like any other. Diddy lay on his stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the prison around him. The occasional footsteps of a guard, the shuffle of an inmate turning over in his bunk, the distant hum of whispered conversations. Sleep didn't come easy in a place like this. He had spent every night since his arrival in a light doze, never fully allowing himself to drift off. Something about the air in here felt heavy, like it carried more than just the weight of the men inside. At first, he thought the sound was just part of the usual noise, the metal clang of a gate sliding open, the low murmur of voices. Then it grew louder, more urgent, boots hitting the floor in quick succession, the sharp bark of orders. By the time he realized what was happening, his cell door burst open. The light from the hallway flooded the tiny room, and before he could sit up, 2 guards were already inside, their faces blank, movements methodical. One shoved him back down with a firm hand on his chest while the other started tearing through his belongings. His blankets were thrown to the floor, his mattress lifted and slammed back down, every inch of his tiny space overturned in a matter of seconds. "Get up," one of them ordered, yanking him to his feet. Diddy's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled forward, disoriented. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice rough from sleep. "Routine search," the taller guard replied, barely looking at him as he rifled through a stack of papers on the small table. His mind raced. Routine? Maybe for them, but not for him. He had been here long enough to see how searches worked. They didn't just randomly pick cells in the middle of the night unless they were looking for something. His stomach turned as he watched them dig deeper, scattering what little he had across the floor like it meant nothing. And then one of them paused. It was subtle, just a flicker of hesitation before the man lifted a handful of documents and tucked them under his arm. Diddy's breath caught. He recognized those pages. Notes, legal notes, things he had written down during his meetings with his attorneys. "Hold up," he said, stepping forward, but the taller guard shoved him back against the wall. "Stay put." His pulse hammered against his ribs. "That's privileged information. You can't take that." Neither of them responded. The taller one signaled to another officer outside, and just like that, they were gone. Diddy stood frozen for a second, trying to process what had just happened. Then the anger hit him like a freight train. He stormed toward the door, gripping the bars. "Hey, I need those back." No answer. The hallway was already quiet again, like nothing had ever happened. His breathing was ragged as he stepped back, hands running over his face. He wasn't new to searches. He had seen plenty of them over the years, knew how the system worked. But this wasn't just some routine shakedown. They had come in with purpose, taken exactly what they wanted, and left everything else behind. His mind spun. What had been in those notes? He had written a lot down, trying to keep track of the details, the strategy, the things his lawyers wanted him to remember. Had there been anything incriminating? Anything that could be twisted against him? The paranoia set in fast. Had this been ordered by someone higher up? Were they looking for something specific? And more importantly, who had told them where to find it? He barely slept the rest of the night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their hands rifling through his things, their cold expressions, the moment of hesitation when they found what they wanted. By morning, his lawyers were already on it. He got word through a rushed conversation in the visitation room, his attorney fuming, demanding answers, calling it an outrageous violation of his rights. The Bureau of Prisons gave its usual response. Routine, standard procedure, just part of the job. Bullshit. Diddy sat there, jaw clenched, as his lawyer ranted about filing complaints, about taking it to the court. He should have felt reassured, but all he could think about was the fact that those notes were already out of his hands, and if someone wanted them badly enough to take them, they sure as hell weren't planning to just give them back. The next few days passed with a new weight pressing down on him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. Now there was something else at play. Someone inside MDC wanted him weaker, wanted him scrambling. And it wasn't just the usual prison politics. The guards were watching him differently now. Some barely acknowledged him, but others lingered just a little too long when passing his cell. It wasn't outright hostility, but it wasn't nothing either. And the inmates? They had noticed the search. Word traveled fast in here. Eyes lingered longer when he moved through the halls. Conversations quieted when he walked by. Even the ones who had taunted him before seemed more measured now, as if they were waiting to see what would happen next. That was the thing about prison. Everything meant something. A guard looking in your direction too many times, a sudden transfer to a different cell block, a late-night search that wasn't supposed to happen. Diddy wasn't a fool. He had built an empire by knowing how to read people, how to see the moves before they happened. And right now, every part of him was screaming that someone was trying to break him. The question was, how far were they willing to go? Chapter 4. Surveillance and psychological breakdown. Diddy had spent his life controlling narratives. He had orchestrated careers, shifted the culture, and kept his empire running with a combination of power, intimidation, and calculated charm. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was the one being moved around the board, and he didn't know who was making the moves. The paranoia had started after the cell search. At first, it had just been a feeling, the weight of unseen eyes, the nagging sense that something wasn't right. He had chalked it up to stress, to adjusting to a world where every interaction was a power struggle. But then the incidents started piling up, and what had once been an uneasy feeling started to feel like certainty. Whenever he sat down with his lawyer in the visitation room, a guard always seemed to be hovering nearby. He had been in enough business meetings to know when someone was pretending not to listen. These guards weren't just there to keep order, they were waiting, watching, listening. One time, in the middle of a conversation about trial strategy, his lawyer had leaned in, whispering something low enough that even Diddy had to strain to hear. "They're monitoring everything," his lawyer muttered, eyes darting to the nearest guard. "You need to be careful about what you say." Diddy had nodded, pretending not to be fazed, but deep down his mind was already spinning. Then his cellmate was switched. Twice. The first guy had been an older man, quiet, not much of a talker. He had barely unpacked before being yanked out and replaced with a younger guy. Someone who asked too many questions. Where was Diddy from? Who did he still talk to on the outside? What kind of legal strategy was he working with? Diddy kept his answers short. The guy was trying too hard to seem friendly, too interested in things that didn't concern him. And just when he started getting a read on the new cellmate, he was gone. Another transfer. That was when it hit him. They were testing him, watching how he reacted, seeing what he would say. He couldn't prove it, but he knew it. And he wasn't the only one who had noticed. One afternoon, while waiting for recreation time, an inmate he barely knew leaned in as he passed. "They may got eyes on you 24/7, the man muttered, just loud enough for Diddy to hear. Then he kept walking. Diddy didn't turn, didn't react, but his heart started hammering in his chest. So it wasn't just in his head, other people saw it too. The whispers had started to get to him. It wasn't just the inmates either. There were nights when he would wake up in his cell and feel the presence of someone standing near the bars, just outside his line of sight. Maybe it was a guard on patrol. Maybe it was something else. One night, he forced himself to stay completely still, waiting, listening. And then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone exhaling sharply, right outside his door. His body tensed, his pulse spiking. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. He just waited. The presence didn't move for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. By morning, he had convinced himself that it hadn't happened, that it was his own mind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew better. His world had shrunk down to the four walls of his cell. He stopped trusting anyone. Conversations became shorter, interactions colder. He ate less, slept less. His body felt different, weaker, but his mind wouldn't let him rest. Every small change in routine, every shift in energy felt like a sign. He had been through high-stakes battles before. He had fought lawsuits, feuds, betrayal, but those were fights he had understood. Those were games he had played by his own rules. This was different. He started making notes in his head instead of writing things down. The guards had already proven that they weren't above taking his paperwork, and he wasn't about to give them another excuse. He started watching who looked at him too long, who nodded at him in passing, who never seemed to be around when things went down. He tried reaching out to his team on the outside, but his messages didn't always go through. Some calls would get cut short, some letters never got responses. And the few messages that did make it through, they felt sanitized, like someone had reviewed them before they reached him. It was like he was being kept in a bubble, cut off from his own people. That was when the fear truly set in. If they were watching him this closely, what was their endgame? Were they waiting for him to break, trying to push him toward a mistake? Or was there something deeper at play, something he hadn't figured out yet? He had built his career on knowing the game, but in here the game wasn't clear. He didn't know who was behind the moves being made, or what they were waiting for. And that was the worst part. Because if there was one thing Diddy had always known, it was that the people who watched in silence were the most dangerous ones of all. Chapter 5. The Unseen Power Structure. Diddy had spent his life believing money could fix anything. A problem arose, money made it disappear. A rival stepped up, money pushed them back down. His wealth had shielded him from consequences, from weakness, from the very idea of losing. But in here, at MDC Brooklyn, money meant nothing. It didn't matter how many millions were sitting in his accounts. It didn't matter that he could still afford the best lawyers, the best crisis teams, or that he had people on the outside working around the clock to get him out. Inside these walls, the currency wasn't dollars. It was power, respect, fear. And Diddy had none of it. There were men here who had built entire empires behind bars. Men who had been locked up for a decade, sometimes two, and still controlled entire operations from the inside. Gang leaders, shot callers, enforcers. These were the real power players in MDC. Some had connections stretching beyond the prison walls. Others had built their influence through sheer brutality. They weren't interested in record labels or platinum albums. They didn't care how many Grammys he had won or how many celebrities still posted Free Diddy on social media. He was just another inmate, and that made him weak. He could feel it whenever he walked through the common areas, the way eyes followed him, the way conversations would shift when he got too close. The whispers weren't just about who he was, they were about what he was worth. Some saw him as a mark, a man who had never been in the trenches, who had spent his life surrounded by security, handlers, lawyers, someone soft, someone who could be squeezed. Others saw something different, an opportunity. The moment came 2 weeks after the cell search, just when he had started to think the paranoia might eat him alive. It happened in the yard, the only place where inmates could breathe fresh air, if you could call the damp, smoggy Brooklyn air fresh. Diddy had been sitting on a bench, keeping to himself, when he noticed a man approaching. Not just any inmate. Someone who moved differently. Someone others respected without needing to demand it. The kind of man who didn't need to posture because his reputation did all the talking for him. The yard got quieter. Conversations dulled. The message was clear. People were paying attention. Diddy stayed seated as the man sat down next to him, his movements calm, controlled. This was someone used to giving orders, not following them. "You ain't running things here," the man said, his voice low but firm. "But you still got value. Question is, how you gonna play it?" Diddy didn't answer right away. He had learned the hard way that power wasn't just about what you said, it was about what you didn't say. The man smirked, shaking his head slightly. "See, out there? You had power, you had money, you had people doing what you told them to do. But in here, all that's gone. And the thing about a man like you, you're alone. No crew, no backup, no leverage." Diddy's stomach tightened. The man wasn't wrong. He had no allies in here, no one to stand beside him if things went sideways. He was completely exposed, and everyone knew it. "You want to stay like that?" the man continued. "Or you want to start making smart choices?" Diddy studied him, trying to get a read. Was this a setup? Was he being tested? But deep down, he already knew. This was a warning. The choice was simple. Stay isolated and he'd be picked apart, or play along and owe something to the wrong people. Neither option felt like a win. Diddy had spent years controlling his environment, ensuring that every situation bent to his will, but this was the first time he wasn't the one in charge. "You don't gotta answer right now," the man said, standing up, adjusting his jumpsuit. "Just know this. If you think you can ride this out on your own, you won't last long." Diddy exhaled slowly, keeping his expression unreadable. The man walked away, blending back into the sea of inmates. The yard returned to normal, conversations picking up again, but something had shifted. Now everyone knew he had been approached. Some men would see that as a sign of protection, others would see it as an opening. Later that night, as he lay on his bunk, the words replayed in his mind. "You ain't running things here, but you still got value. Question is, how you gonna play it?" His instincts told him that the real danger wasn't physical violence, it was what came next. The real power struggles happened in whispers, alliances, unseen exchanges, and right now he was on the outside looking in. The problem was, not everyone wanted him alive. There were forces moving against him. He could feel it, creeping in from all sides. If he aligned with the wrong people, he'd be done. But if he didn't, he might not make it to trial at all. Chapter 6. The Health Crisis, Real or Manipulation? Diddy had always taken pride in his appearance. For decades, he had maintained an image of power. His tailored suits, his flawless skin, the way he carried himself with an air of invincibility. He was the man who never cracked, who never let the world see him sweat. But that man was gone now. The weight loss had started almost immediately. It wasn't just the food, though the barely edible slop served on plastic trays certainly didn't help. It was the stress, the endless tension that lived in his body now, the nights spent staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen, the unease of knowing he was being watched but not knowing by whom. At first it was subtle. His jumpsuit feeling just a little looser, his reflection in the scratched-up mirror above the sink looking slightly more hollow. But after a few weeks, it was undeniable. His cheekbones were sharper, his jawline more pronounced. The veins in his hands stood out more than they used to. He stopped eating regularly, pushing food around his tray instead of forcing it down. His appetite was gone, but it was more than that. He felt sick, though he couldn't tell if it was real or if his body was just finally responding to the mental strain. The headaches were the worst. They came in waves, pounding at his skull like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. Some days they were so bad he could barely see straight. He tried drinking more water, tried forcing down the bland, overcooked beans and cardboard-like bread, but it didn't help. The guards noticed, of course. They always noticed everything, but they didn't care. When he told one of them he needed medical attention, the response was a lazy shrug. "You ain't dying, get in line like everyone else." Another time, he had pressed his forehead against the cool metal bars of his cell and muttered, "I need a doctor." The guard on duty barely glanced up from his post. "Funny how you start feeling sick after that last bail denial," the man said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "You think we don't know the game?" Diddy clenched his jaw but said nothing. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but anger wouldn't do him any good. That was the problem, no one believed him. Prison officials were suspicious. Was this real, or was he playing sick to get himself moved to a better facility? They had seen it before. High-profitable inmates suddenly developing health problems when things weren't going their way. Requests for transfers to medical units, softer conditions, special treatment. And maybe, under different circumstances, Diddy would have played that card. Maybe he would have tried to work the system, find a way to use it to his advantage. But this wasn't a game. His body was betraying him, and no one gave a damn. The more he pushed for medical attention, the more the system seemed to push back. His requests disappeared into the void of paperwork. The so-called routine checkups consisted of little more than a nurse glancing at him through the bars and asking, "You breathing?" He wasn't the only inmate suffering from medical neglect. MDC Brooklyn was notorious for it. Men with real conditions, diabetes, heart disease, infections, were left untreated for days, sometimes weeks. Some never got treatment at all. It was just another part of the unwritten rules of survival in this place. The difference was, Diddy wasn't just another inmate, he was a public figure, a spectacle, and that was about to work against him in ways he never expected. It started with a photo, a leaked image of him in court. It was his first public appearance in weeks, and the moment he stepped into the courtroom, the cameras captured what the prison had done to him. The man who had once commanded stages, who had stood at the center of the world's biggest parties, looked gaunt, pale, diminished. His jumpsuit hung off his frame. His face was thinner than it had ever been, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The image spread like wildfire. Social media exploded. "He looks like he's dying in there. This is what happens when the system wants you gone. Is he really guilty, or are they just breaking him down?" The debate started immediately. Some people saw the photo and felt sorry for him. Others saw it and called it a performance. "This is just a stunt," a well-known analyst said on a talk show. "This is classic manipulation. Look weak, get sympathy, work the system. It's what powerful men do when they get caught." But then there were the ones who weren't so sure. "This is the same prison that let people die from untreated illnesses," a former inmate tweeted. "You don't have to like Diddy, but don't pretend this place isn't designed to break people." The media ran with it. Talk show hosts debated whether he was being mistreated or if he was simply playing the long game. The story shifted from his crimes to his condition. And in MDC, that was a dangerous thing. Because if there was one thing the people running the prison hated, it was attention. Diddy could feel the shift the moment he returned from court. The guards' stares lingered a little longer. Their tone was a little sharper. They weren't happy. He had become a problem. The next time he asked to see a doctor, the response was colder than before. "You wanted attention?" A guard sneered. "Congratulations, you got it." That was when he realized just how deep the hole he was in had gotten. Outside, people were talking about him. Some were demanding answers, but inside these walls, where it really mattered, the people in control weren't concerned about his health. They were concerned about shutting him up. And that meant if he really was sick, if his body really was failing him, no one was going to help him. And worse, no one would believe him if he said otherwise. Chapter 7. The Final Straw. The Ultimate Betrayal. Diddy had learned to live with the whispers. They had followed him from the moment he stepped into MDC Brooklyn, shifting and twisting, carrying different meanings depending on who was doing the talking. At first, they were about his fame, his wealth, the life he once had. Later, they were about his weakness, about how the mighty had fallen. But now the whispers were different. They weren't just idle talk. They weren't just men passing the time with gossip. There was something sharper in them, something pointed, and for the first time he wasn't sure whether the people whispering were his enemies or the only ones willing to warn him. The rumor started small, a single sentence overheard at the tail end of a conversation near the phones. "They're moving him." Diddy barely reacted at first. He had heard plenty of talk before. People swore up and down that he'd be out by now, that his lawyers would pull off some last-minute miracle, that a man like him couldn't really go down like this. But this was different. This wasn't about him leaving MDC. This was about him being moved. Prisons didn't just move high-profile inmates for no reason. Transfers weren't routine at his level, not unless there was a problem. Either they thought he was in danger, or they thought he was the danger, and neither of those things boded well for him. He had to find out what was really happening. That meant doing something he never liked doing, asking for help. He approached an inmate he had seen dealing information before, a man who traded in rumors the way men on the outside traded stocks. Information was currency in a place like this, and Diddy had nothing left to barter with except his name and whatever scraps of goodwill he hadn't burned yet. The man barely looked at him before shaking his head. "You're not hearing everything. It's not just about you getting moved. Someone's selling your ass out." Diddy felt a slow, creeping chill settle into his bones. "What do you mean?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "I mean somebody in here's talking, feeding them information, shit they shouldn't know." The man studied him. "Who are you pissed off?" Diddy didn't have an answer. That night he lay awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, running through the list of possibilities. A guard, a fellow inmate, someone from his own damn team? It didn't make sense. Who could possibly be passing information about him to someone on the outside? And what kind of information was being passed? The next morning, he made his move. He had avoided the prison phones as much as possible, knowing they were monitored, knowing anything he said could and would be used against him. But he didn't have another option. He needed to talk to his people, figure out who was still on his side. When he dialed the first number, it rang too long before going to voicemail. He hung up and tried again. Same thing. He tried another, then another. No one was picking up. For weeks, his lawyers, his business associates, the people who once circled him like planets around the sun, had been frantic, working every angle to free him, to do damage control. But now, silence. That was when the real fear set in. Diddy had always known how to control a room, how to dictate the terms of any conversation. But now, he wasn't just losing power, he had already lost it. The people who had once depended on him, the ones who had built their careers on his name, were backing away. And then he heard something that sent a different kind of panic through him. It's one of his own. The words came from a hushed conversation 2 tables away in the cafeteria, just loud enough to catch his ear, but too quiet to give him details. One of his own. Someone close. His stomach twisted in a way that had nothing to do with the barely edible food on his tray. He had spent years making enemies. He had crushed competition, shut down rivals, burned bridges with people who had once called him a friend. He knew there were plenty of people on the outside who wanted to see him fall, but the worst betrayals, the ones that really cut deep, they didn't come from outsiders. They came from the people you trusted, the ones you never saw coming. He had always known that, and yet somehow he hadn't seen this coming. For the next 2 days, he barely spoke to anyone. He listened, watched, tried to catch the fragments of conversation that weren't meant for him. The problem was, now that he was looking for it, the information had already dried up. That was another thing about prison. When people realized you were looking for something, they made sure you never found it. Then, on the 3rd day, he got his answer. It came through a note slipped under his meal tray, a single word written in quick, almost careless handwriting. Cassie. His blood ran cold. He hadn't thought about her in weeks, not in the way that mattered. He had been too busy trying to keep himself from slipping further into the pit MDC had dug for him. He had been focused on the now. But if Cassie was involved, if the whispers were about her, it meant that everything was worse than he thought. Cassie had been with him for over a decade, more than a girlfriend, more than just another industry relationship. She had known everything. She had seen everything. And she had every reason to turn on him. Diddy's hands curled into fists. His pulse pounded in his ears. If she was the one feeding information to the outside, if she had been working against him this whole time, then this wasn't just a betrayal. This was a sentence. Because Cassie wasn't just someone from his past. She was the one who could end him for good. Chapter 8, The Inevitable Fall. The trial was set. The dates were locked in. The press was circling like vultures, waiting for the moment he would step into the courtroom and face the world as the defendant, not the mogul. It should have been the moment where he mounted his defense, where his high-powered attorneys did what they were paid to do, turn the tide in his favor, sow doubt, make people wonder if this had all been some massive conspiracy against him. That was the plan, that was how it was supposed to go. But inside MDC Brooklyn, none of that mattered. Diddy sat alone in his cell, staring at the wall, hands resting on his knees. His jumpsuit was loose, his face gaunt, his once sharp features dulled by weeks of exhaustion, paranoia, and hunger. He had tried to fight it. He had tried to hold on to some piece of the man he had been on the outside. But this place, these people, these whispers, these games, had broken him down piece by piece. The trial was coming, but the truth was, he wasn't sure he'd make it that far. There had been too many signs. The sudden searches, the shifting alliances, the sense that he was being watched, not just by the guards, but by someone else. The last few weeks had left him more isolated than ever, and that was when he knew something was coming. Prison wasn't just about survival, it was about who controlled the environment, and right now, Diddy wasn't in control of anything. He had tried to reach out to his team again. He had used every connection he had left, every favor he thought he could still pull. But the calls kept going to voicemail. The messages weren't returned. The people who had once moved mountains for him were suddenly nowhere to be found. His lawyers still showed up, but even they looked different now, less confident, more distant. They still spoke in legal jargon, still threw around phrases like reasonable doubt and insufficient evidence. But Diddy could hear what they weren't saying. They didn't believe he could win. Maybe they didn't even believe in him at all anymore. The world outside still debated whether he was guilty, whether this was justice or a takedown of a black billionaire. Some people still defended him, still swore up and down that he would beat the charges, that money would do what money always did, make problems disappear. But inside these walls, he had no defenders left. And that was what truly terrified him. A few nights before his next hearing, something changed. It wasn't anything obvious, just a shift in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. The guards who had once treated him with thinly veiled contempt now barely looked at him at all. The ones who used to linger near his cell, watching him like he was some kind of spectacle, had moved on to other things. It was almost like he was being phased out, or worse, like he was being left alone on purpose. And that was when he knew. Someone inside didn't want him to make it to trial. That was the game all along, wasn't it? Not to keep him locked up, not to let the courts decide his fate, but to make sure he never walked into that courtroom at all. Diddy lay awake that night, listening to the silence, the usual sounds of prison life. The distant murmurs, the occasional cough, the scuffle of movement felt thinner, less familiar. He had been in this place long enough to recognize patterns, and something about this night felt off. His instinct screamed at him, told him to stay awake, to be ready. But for what? What was coming? Footsteps. Not the heavy, deliberate steps of the guards on patrol. Lighter, quieter, too quiet. He turned his head toward the bars, but the corridor was empty, or at least it looked empty. He sat up slowly, the mattress creaking beneath him. His pulse was in his throat now, hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. Another footstep, then silence. Diddy exhaled slowly. He wasn't going to panic, not now, not when everything was about to come to a head. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the feeling was gone. The corridor was empty again. The presence, whoever or whatever it had been, had vanished. Alex looked around nervously, keeping his eyes focused. The sound of his heart pounded. But Diddy knew better than to think that was the end of it. He lay back down, but he didn't sleep. He just waited. And when the morning came, when the doors clanged open and the routine of another day in MDC Brooklyn began, he knew he had made it through the night. But he didn't know how many more nights he had left. The world was watching. The trial was set. The headlines were already being written. But none of it mattered if he didn't make it out of this place alive. And for the first time in his life, Diddy truly understood what it meant to be powerless. The cell door slammed shut, and he didn't move.